The atmosphere inside the CBI office is unusually relaxed. The team is enjoying a rare moment of calm, something that doesn't happen very often in their line of work. Patrick Jane is casually leaning against a table, watching Teresa Lisbon with that familiar smile of his, a mixture of amusement and challenge. Suddenly, he asks her to imagine one shape inside another, without giving her any further explanation. Lisbon, accustomed to his mind games, frowns but accepts the challenge, silently concentrating on the task. Jane begins to speak, guiding her with vague, almost hypnotic words, as if he can actually see inside her mind. After a few seconds, he confidently announces that she was thinking of a triangle inside a circle. True to her character, Lisbon immediately denies that he got it right. She isn't about to give him that satisfaction. However, after a few moments, honesty takes over, and she admits that it was just a lucky guess. Patrick clearly enjoys the surprise he creates, along with the mysterious aura that surrounds him. With completely fake seriousness, he explains that this was only the calibration key, and that now, thanks to it, he should be able to read Teresa's deepest thoughts. She responds skeptically and challenges him to tell her what she's thinking at that very moment. Jane doesn't hesitate. He claims that she's thinking about how relieved she is that he's only joking and that he can't actually read her mind. Lisbon tries to deny it, but her reaction gives her away. Patrick smiles, satisfied. The fun is interrupted when Cho approaches with a serious expression and a case file in his hand. There's been another homicide. The team immediately gets to work and heads to a small town called Marquesa. In the middle of an open field, the agents walk behind Trey Pillar, the local police chief. The air still smells of smoke. In front of them sits a completely burned-out vehicle. Rich Garcia had been inside, but the fire was so intense that barely any recognizable remains were left. Jane studies the scene carefully, and to Pillar's surprise, comments on how difficult it must be to bury someone you served with. Pillar explains that he and Garcia served together on 2 overseas missions with the National Guard. Rigsby, the team's arson specialist, examines the remains of the vehicle. Pillar becomes uneasy when he asks whether Rigsby will be able to determine if it was an accident. Rigsby quickly confirms that this wasn't just arson, but murder. The garage had been locked from the outside with a padlock, and an extremely powerful accelerant had been used, a type of fuel normally reserved for professional use. The method was clean, precise, and sophisticated. This wasn't the work of an amateur. The investigation splits up. Van Pelt and Rigsby head into town to speak with Mitchell Reese, the man Garcia had planned to visit on the night he died. Lisbon and Jane go to the Garcia home to speak with his widow, Susan. From the very beginning, Jane appears distracted, eating a pastry and looking at family photographs, but in reality, he doesn't miss a single detail. Susan Garcia welcomes them, visibly shaken. With her is Ben Machado, a local real estate agent and Garcia and Pillar's former fellow soldier. Jane notices something interesting. Several times, Pillar touches Susan's arm or hand with a familiar gesture, and she discreetly pulls away. The gesture is subtle, but it doesn't escape Jane's attention. While Lisbon asks the formal questions, Jane crosses paths with Maddie, Garcia's teenage daughter, who is hostile and distant. From her, he learns that her father used to display military memorabilia inside a glass cabinet, but suddenly put everything away without explanation. He also discovers that her parents' marriage had been going through a crisis, and that Maddie suspects her mother was having an affair. Jane returns to the room just as Susan begins describing the events of the night of the murder. In the middle of her account, Tommy Olds, a local man, walks in carrying some corn tortillas. Susan describes him as someone with certain mental limitations who does odd jobs around town. When Maddie hears this, she explodes in anger, accusing her mother of always lying, and storms out of the house. Jane, as direct as ever, tells Susan that her daughter is angry because she believes her mother's lover, Trey Pillar, killed her father. Susan vehemently denies it, but Jane lays out 2 possible scenarios. Either the 2 of them conspired together and Susan now regrets it, or Pillar acted alone because he wanted her for himself. Finally, Susan admits to the relationship, but insists that she had nothing to do with the murder. Meanwhile, back in town, Reese tells Rigsby and Van Pelt that he was with Garcia until 10 that night, talking about cars. Then he mentions something disturbing. This isn't the first time someone from their unit has died by fire. Years earlier, Dave Martin died in a fire. Before they can investigate further, Van Pelt receives an urgent alert. Trey Pillar's house is on fire. The team rushes to the scene and finds the house completely engulfed in flames. Screams can be heard coming from inside. Without thinking twice, Rigsby runs inside. Seconds later, a chair crashes through a window, and Rigsby comes flying out with Pillar in his arms, his own arm engulfed in flames. Van Pelt reacts quickly and manages to put the fire out. Later, at the hotel, Van Pelt treats Rigsby's burns. He is sedated and isn't feeling any pain. Pillar, however, is in critical condition. Lisbon and Jane explain that Pillar was drugged before the fire, which seems to rule him out as a suspect in Garcia's murder. Cho confirms that the method used to start the fire is identical to the previous one. The threat is still out there, and the real killer is still at large. With the fire at Trey Pillar's house still fresh in everyone's minds, the investigation takes an even darker turn. Cho is ordered to question Susan Garcia again, while Lisbon and Patrick head to Alden's Grove, the place where Dave Martin died years earlier. Something about that name is beginning to weigh more heavily on the case. At the Garcia home, Cho approaches Susan calmly but firmly. He points out how strange it is that both her husband and Dave Martin, members of the same military unit, died by fire. Susan insists that Dave's death was an accident, that he fell asleep with a cigarette and the fire consumed everything. But when Cho digs a little deeper, he discovers that Dave was involved in a business partnership with Trey Pillar, Rich Garcia, and Ben Machado. The partnership had purchased 5 acres of land in Alden's Grove, supposedly to give Dave a place to live and keep him away from the legal troubles that constantly followed him because of his alcoholism. After his death, the land was left in the hands of the other partners. Now Ben Machado is the only one of them still alive. Tommy Olds currently lives on that same property and takes care of the land. Lisbon and Jane arrive at Alden's Grove, an isolated, dry place devastated by drought. An old trailer sits in the middle of the property. Tommy Olds cautiously sticks his head out and greets them with his usual awkward, timid attitude. While Lisbon asks him some simple questions, Patrick wanders off and starts exploring. Behind the trailer, he finds something curious, a copy of Moby Dick alongside children's books and toys. Far too sophisticated for someone who supposedly has a limited mind. Further away, he discovers a fenced-in garden. The soil is wet, completely soaked with water, something that should be impossible in the middle of such a severe drought. Lisbon joins him. Nervous, Tommy begs them not to tell anyone, afraid they will force him to leave. Patrick casually explains that the water is coming from an underground aquifer, a water source that could be worth millions. Suddenly, the motive behind the murders becomes terrifyingly clear. That night at the motel, Van Pelt takes care of Rigsby. Still under the effects of the painkillers, he rambles and tells her how beautiful her name is. Between awkward but sincere words, he confesses that he's in love with her. Grace is completely caught off guard. Gently, she explains that although she cares about him, they work together, and she doesn't want to ruin her career over a complicated relationship. She realizes too late that Rigsby has already fallen asleep without hearing the end of what she was saying. Meanwhile, Cho and Van Pelt go to Ben Machado's house. Nobody answers the door. As they approach the barn, they hear gunshots. Machado fires at them until they identify themselves as agents. They manage to subdue him, and while searching the property, Cho finds several containers of ethyl ether, the same accelerant used in the fires. At the Marquesa police station, Machado angrily defends himself. He says they're framing him, that someone wants him dead because he, Garcia, and Pillar were business partners. Cho reminds him that if the others are dead, he would be the only owner of the land containing the aquifer. Machado continues to deny everything. Patrick enters the room and in his usual friendly tone, suggests something unexpected. Dave Martin never actually died, that he faked his death so he could take revenge on the people who tried to kill him and take the land for themselves. The idea hangs in the air. Patrick asks them to release Machado, convinced that the real killer will come after him. Lisbon becomes furious over the decision, but Patrick insists. As far as he's concerned, Machado deserves to die for what he did. That night, Cho and Rigsby watch Machado's house. They discuss other possible suspects and decide to leave and question Reese again. As soon as they leave, Machado comes out armed and enters the barn. The door suddenly slams shut. He isn't alone. A figure covers him in ether and threatens him with a lighter, claiming to be Dave Martin, back from the dead. Terrified, Machado confesses through screams that he and his partners started the fire that supposedly killed Dave. Suddenly, the figure removes the mask. It's Patrick Jane, recorder in hand. Before he can finish the deception, everything spirals out of control. A second voice appears, one even Patrick wasn't expecting. A Molotov cocktail comes crashing through the door and the barn begins to burn. Jane and Machado escape through the back. Cho and Rigsby return just in time to see the flames, and in the distance, Tommy Olds watching from the field. They run after him. At the Marquesa police station, Tommy Olds is sitting in the interrogation room. His posture is relaxed, almost absent-minded. He seems unable to understand why he's there. Cho begins asking him basic questions, but Tommy responds with vague answers, gets distracted easily, and repeatedly asks for a soda. His behavior is exactly what everyone has come to expect from him: simple, disconnected, and harmless. Outside, Lisbon paces back and forth, visibly frustrated. All the evidence points to Tommy, but something doesn't add up. The fires were far too complex, far too precise. None of that matches the image of a mentally limited man. Patrick watches the scene with a slight smile, as if he already has every piece of the puzzle in place. Without saying a word, he enters the room and asks Cho to let him continue the interrogation. Patrick sits across from Tommy and begins casually, talking about books. He mentions Moby Dick and deliberately makes a mistake when naming Captain Ahab's ship. Tommy corrects him almost without thinking. The silence becomes heavy. Jane looks up and smiles. Calmly, he tells Tommy that he knows now, that he always knew. That book, that automatic correction, gave him away. He explains that he has realized everything was an act, a carefully constructed mask Tommy had maintained for years. Patrick congratulates him on his performance, on how well he pretended to be someone he wasn't. He tells him there's no point in keeping up the act anymore. The game is over. Slowly, something changes in Tommy. His expression becomes sharper, his posture straightens, and as if he were finally taking a weight off his shoulders, his true personality emerges effortlessly. Tommy admits that he was never disabled, pretending protected him. People expected nothing from him, underestimated him, and forgave everything he did. That allowed him to observe, listen, and wait. He explains that when he learned about the permit to exploit the aquifer in Aldensgrove, he understood the truth. Dave Martin had been murdered by his own partners, burned alive so they could take the land. From that moment on, he decided to avenge him. He planned every fire with precision. He killed Rich Garcia and tried to kill Trey Pillar. To him, it wasn't simply revenge. It was justice, redemption. Patrick listens in silence. He tells Tommy that revenge always comes at a high price, but Tommy responds that it was worth it. He says Patrick couldn't possibly understand. Jane stares at him, knowing that perhaps one day he will understand it all too well. Before they take him away, Tommy makes one final request. Tell Maddie Garcia that he's sorry for hurting her. Later, Lisbon and Patrick visit Maddie to deliver the message. She reacts furiously, screaming that if Tommy ever gets out of prison, she'll burn him alive. Patrick tries to calm her down and tells her that revenge is a poison, something that only destroys the person who consumes it. Maddie doesn't listen and retreats deeper into her anger. As they leave, Lisbon watches Patrick carefully. She can't help remembering what he said earlier about Red John and the punishment certain men deserve. On the porch, before they leave, she comments that he seems to have changed his mind about revenge. Patrick stops for a moment and then answers with brutal honesty. He says he told the girl that because it sounded good, because it was the right thing to say at that moment. But it wasn't true. They were just empty words. Lisbon looks at him, trying to reconcile the man who comforts a teenage girl with the man who can talk about death without blinking. Patrick simply gives her a faint smile, that familiar smile that never quite reaches his eyes. As they walk away, it becomes clear that beneath his charming facade, Patrick Jane carries a silent darkness, an open wound that has never healed, and a promise of revenge that is still alive. If you enjoyed this episode, don't stop here. Head over to my channel and check out the complete playlist of The Mentalist, with every episode organized in order from beginning to end. Watch the full series, follow Patrick Jane's journey, and discover all the hidden details, mysteries, and secrets along the way. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more The Mentalist episodes, breakdowns, and stories.